Welcome, everyone, to the Week 11 Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky. Joined with me, as always, is the Associate Director of Fantasy Betting at the 33rd Team, Ryan Reynolds. Today, we're going to be discussing my rest of season fantasy rankings and some actionable, concrete types of trades that you can be offering to your league mates. And we will also discuss some interesting, potentially controversial movement in Ryan's NFL power rankings. Those help power his over-under bets against the spread bets and just how he's generally viewing the playoff picture. Ryan, I'm going to hand it over to you, and then let's start chatting some quarterbacks.
Yeah, we want to make money in fantasy football, Josh. Obviously, that's what we're here for. We want to give the good people some insights. Let's start with this one. You bump Patrick Mahomes into the same tier as Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen among quarterbacks. Tell the good people why you've made this decision.
Well, he's off his bye. Mahomes has never lost after his bye. The Chiefs averaged 31 points coming off of their bye. People talk a lot about Andy Reid off the bye, Mahomes off the bye. It's because it's true. You give the best play caller quarterback duo probably in NFL history an extra week to game plan. The results are pretty good. So sort of like when we talk about with your power rankings where we want to kind of anticipate sometimes what's going to happen next week. I think the public perception of Patrick Mahomes is going to increase. I want to get out ahead of that. This week he faces the Eagles. They allow the third most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. A nice get-right shootout on Monday Night Football. Mahomes' value returns. And the rest of this season, I love the schedule. After the Eagles, Raiders. They're going to shred them. The Packers have been struggling. We've had many injuries in that secondary. The Buffalo Bills, a defense now depleted by injury. The Patriots, another defense depleted by injury. Oh my goodness, they get the Raiders again. And then in week 17, they get the Bengals. That to me looks like, 5, 6, 300-yard performances upcoming. I think Mahomes is going to be back for fantasy football. So I'm simply getting out ahead of it a week earlier than everyone else.
That's Jay Larky tweets his rest of season rankings and trade calculators on the 33rdteam.com right now. You might notice we had a redesign on our site, which we hope you enjoy. Next up, Josh, the Dolphins are currently coming off their bye. They played the Chiefs in London last week, or I think it was actually Germany, Europe. Absolute smash spot this week against the Raiders. Yet you want to sell Tua Tagovailoa right now. Why is that?
Yeah, so they faced the Raiders this week. Their implied team total is 30 points. That's by far the highest of any team this year or this week. That's how you need to sell him. They're facing the Raiders. They're going to smash. Because the week after is the Jets, and I do not have high expectations for Tua in that matchup. I understand that after the Jets, they get the Commanders and the Titans. Those are two very strong matchups. But weeks 15, 16, 17, they get the Jets again. They have 2 games against the Jets these next few weeks. Then they get the Cowboys. And then for week 17, when all the money's on the line, they go on the road to the Ravens. And I'm just not that excited about that schedule. Tua Tagovailoa has some of the craziest splits when it comes to how he does against good and bad defenses. I simply don't want to gamble on that. It's tough to see him giving you 25 fantasy points. Any of those final 3 weeks, I don't think he's a difference maker in the fantasy playoffs. I am looking to ship him off to get someone with more upside during that playoff stretch.
Next up, Josh, Trevor Lawrence. He has some DFS viability this week against the Titans secondary, but he's underwhelmed to this point in the year. I think few would argue with that. We've recently discussed he's more of a high-end streaming option than a plug-and-play quarterback. Now, if you want an upgrade or someone to pair with Lawrence, what's your strategy for that right now, Josh?
Yeah, a guy that he pairs really nicely with is Brock Purdy's schedule rest of season. And one thing that I would do in trade talks, since a lot of people out there, they think, all right, thanks, Josh, I am going to get Brock Purdy. And I think the issue with that is other fantasy managers know exactly what you're doing. So I would actually try to get Brock Purdy as a throw-in where it's not quite as obvious that you're trying to ping pong quarterbacks rest of season. So maybe you trade fantasy wide receiver 2 types and you say, hey, I've got Mike Evans and Tyler Algier. I want Jalen Waddle and Brock Purdy. The person does not necessarily realize Brock Purdy is the feature guy because Waddle Evans is pretty lateral. It's not as obvious. The guard doesn't go up because we all know that your league mates are probably spiteful. So I think a lateral move at something like receiver or running back and then having Purdy as the throw-in makes it a little bit less obvious that that's really what you're trying to do is balance Lawrence and Purdy, because you're going to get pretty elite streamer type matchups rest of season if you bounce back and forth between those two.
I like that. I've done that myself with one team. Now, Josh, next up, give us the cheapest quarterback streaming tandem with high upside for the fantasy playoffs.
I would say it's Russell Wilson and Geno Smith. These guys are both pretty much free in fantasy football. Week 14, Russell Wilson travels to the Los Angeles Chargers, the second best matchup for quarterbacks. Week 15, Geno plays the Eagles at home, third best matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. Week 16, Geno travels to the Titans. The pass rush is a little scary, but the Titans are still allowing the fourth highest yards per attempt to opposing passers. Seahawks are probably going to be in the playoff hunt pretty fringe. They're going to have to win that one. Titans are most likely going to be completely out of it. And then week 17, Russell Wilson. You welcome him back into your lineup because he gets the Chargers again. Again, the second best matchup. So you're getting the second, third, second best matchups. And the one that's not truly elite for fantasy points is the Titans. And I would fully expect Geno Smith to be airing it out against that unit in a must-win game.
You know, waiver wire options, they're available in most leagues, but trades, Josh, a big question that any fantasy analyst gets is, okay, we want to target this player in trades. How do we acquire them? With that in mind, Josh, give us some realistic ways to go and get Jahmyr Gibbs.
So you can see my rest of season rankings and trade chart on the 33rd team, and a couple trades that you could just do one for one running back wise is potentially Tony Pollard or DeAndre Swift. I think there's some people out there that would try and sell, quote unquote, sell high on Gibbs. I think another one that's very sexy is Devon Achane. And I think rather than worrying about Devon Achane and what his workload will be, we already talked about that scary Dolphins schedule. I think he is the lead back. I also think Gibbs is the lead back on the Lions, and I'd rather bet on the Lions rest of season with Gibbs in that role than Achane. Gibbs even has more of a receiving role, which we like for fantasy football. So if you have Achane, just swap him for Gibbs. If you want to go cross-positionally, I think you could actually trade Justin Jefferson away to get Jahmyr Gibbs. I have a hard time understanding how Justin Jefferson, TJ Hockenson, and Jordan Addison all get there with Josh Dobbs. Really, it just makes me want Josh Dobbs more when you think of that supporting cast. Few 2-for-1s. I think someone like Mike Evans and Brian Robinson gets you Jahmyr Gibbs. I think Adam Thielen and Ramondre Stevenson could get you Jahmyr Gibbs. I think something like Lamar Jackson and Isaiah Pacheco for Kyler Murray and Jahmyr Gibbs gets you Jahmyr Gibbs, where it's a slight downgrade at quarterback, slight upgrade at running back. I think these are all pretty realistic, and my trade calculator will show that it agrees and that these are all pretty realistic 2-for-1 and 1-for-1 and 2-for-1 type trades.
I like those 2-for-1 options, Josh. I got to be honest with you. If I have any of those, I don't have a lot of Ramondre Stevenson, but if I do, I'm going to try to do something like that this week. Next up, Josh, we like Jahmyr Gibbs. We even like Devon Achane, even though you said you'd swap him for Gibbs. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, which running back room has your least favorite schedule for the fantasy playoffs?
There are a lot of tweets circulating. People are shocked. The RB7 in total fantasy points per game this year is Brian Robinson. Oh my goodness. We need to be acquiring Brian Robinson. How did we not know this guy was scoring fantasy points? It's time to sell him. I hate the Commanders' schedule towards the end of the year. They have a week 14 bye. Week 16, they travel to New York to face the Jets. Week 17, they face the 49ers. Bye. Week 15. Then Jets. Then Niners. What I am saying is that 3 of the final 4 weeks of the season, you do not want to start Brian Robinson. Get him off your fantasy squad this week. He gets the Giants. That is a tasty matchup. Sell him to your league mate who is desperate for fantasy points this week, and thank me later.
We're continuing to talk about your rest of season rankings, Josh, and your trade calculator is valuable. You're trying to figure out how we can realistically acquire players. Now let's talk about a situation we want to get out of. What are some trade ideas to get rid of Saquon Barkley?
Yeah, I don't think there's any running back I want to get rid of more than Saquon Barkley. A guy that's going to be getting you 20 touches a game and probably nothing more than 10 to 12 fantasy points each week. Sounds like you're carrying a massive injury risk without upside. That is what Saquon Barkley is, attached to Tommy DeVito in that offensive line. I would rather have Isaiah Pacheco. I would rather have Joe Mixon. I would even rather have Devonta Smith. I would trade for Devonta Smith before people realize that he's probably going to get 8, 9, 10 targets with Dallas Goedert out of the lineup. I would even trade Saquon away for something like a James Conner, Chris Godwin package. I think something like that is very attainable. We need to get out of Saquon Barkley. And I think my trade chart is a great way to do that. And those are some options that my chart would recommend and endorse that I think are incredibly realistic. Let's now turn. Let's talk some power rankings. We chatted some quarterbacks, some running backs rest of season. We'll hit the receivers and tight ends shortly. When I looked through your power rankings, Ryan, on the33team.com, I saw that you have the Miami Dolphins at 5 and the Detroit Lions at 6. I was a little annoyed. The Lions just beat my Chargers, and this felt a little disrespectful. I thought the Chargers were good. Maybe they're not as good. Talk to me about the Dolphins versus Lions rest of season.
So this is a tough one. There were 3 or 4 really tough decisions this week, and this was one of them. But here's how I see it. Miami is an elite offense. You could even frame them as the best or most dangerous offense in the league. Detroit is a well-balanced offense, but I wouldn't quite say that they have the ceiling that the Dolphins do. As long as Tyreek Hill is healthy. Miami plays 5 sub-500 teams in a row. I think the Lions are also going to end up with an inflated schedule long-term because they have a lot of soft opponents. But the Dolphins are set to go on a run here. The Bills basically left the door to the AFC is wide open. Both teams have excellent coaching staff, so I don't really give either one of them a nod there. The narrative on Miami is they haven't beaten anyone good. They beat the Chargers on opening day. The Chargers are a good team. They lost to the Eagles and the Chiefs, who I have first and second in my power rankings, and they beat the Bills when they're at full strength. Here's who's Detroit's played, though. They just had the same game against the Chargers as the Dolphins did on opening day. Lost a tight shootout. They lost to the Ravens 38-6. Pretty impressive stuff there. Lost to the Seahawks at home 37-31 in overtime. And everyone points to the Chiefs win on opening day, 21-20. 3-yard drag was tipped and picked off by the Lions, returned for a touchdown, scored 14 points on offense. No Travis Kelce, no Chris Jones. I don't care about that game as much as most people do. So, the Lions defense, people talk about the Lions defense having a top 10 defense. They've faced 4 above average offenses this year. They've given up 37 points or more to 3 of them. They're kind of, as people say, that Dolphins offense hasn't succeeded against real defenses. Lions defense hasn't really succeeded against real offenses. So I think Detroit's a solid football team, but I think the Dolphins are a little bit more dangerous. Give them the slight nod.
I like your thinking there. Guys, make sure you're following Ryan Reynolds at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Before we keep going, let's talk a little bit about the overall power rankings process, because I think a lot of people out there are going to really enjoy how you talk about these individual teams. What are a few overarching principles that you're trying to help guide you throughout this process?
So we talk about this all the time. I've watched every snap of every NFL game since 2014. I do that because I bet on football in a variety of ways. I think that gives me an edge in power rankings because there's little things that happen in games that are sustainable, and there's other things that aren't. For instance, one that I often talk about is the Seahawks beating the Browns with P.J. Walker. There was a drop pick 6 in that game. Geno Smith was dicey. I don't treat that as a Seahawks win, really. It's more of a neutral event for me. I ground my power rankings in betting markets. I'm aware of the schedule too. For instance, if the Lions had a harder schedule than Miami, that would have been a non-decision for me. But I expect Miami's going to win at least 4 of the next 5. So I want to ground them in where I think they're going to be. So those are 2 things that I do that I don't think a lot of other people that do power rankings pay attention to.
Guys, that's Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. You can view all his work on the33team.com. Power rankings, thoughts on Survivor, what he's betting on in each game, his picks and predictions for every single game. You need to be following him and checking out all of his work. Now, some people out there might wonder, all right, for this week, what was the toughest cluster to figure out? And I know that for you, having the Browns at 8, Texans at 9, Jaguars at 10, Bengals at 11. Those 4 were really difficult. It took a lot of time for you. Outline Browns, Texans, Jags, Bengals in that order.
Yeah, the Texans beating the Bengals and the Bills losing to the Broncos really gummed up the works for me this week. Because how I view these teams individually is now that, I did power rankings when Deshaun Watson was healthy, so I'll stick to that for this. I'd have the Browns at 8, the Bengals at 9, the Jaguars at 10, and the Texans at 11, just because the Texans are a very young team. But Houston's beaten the Jaguars and just last week the Bengals. So you can't really have them behind those teams in this present moment, especially with them playing the Jaguars in 2 weeks. I'll wait to see how that settles out. With Cleveland now, with Dorian Thompson-Robinson Might have the last name backwards actually.
No,
Or
you
PJ.
got that right.
I
DTR.
got that right. Or PJ Walker at quarterback. I would, if I could do that over, I'd have the Browns at 11 now, and I'd move everyone up a little bit. But I stressed out over that one. The other thing I'll add for the Texans is, while CJ Stroud's been great and D'Amico Ryans has been great, they have a very manageable schedule in the second half. So, we'll see what happens. But that was the toughest one of the year for me.
Let's talk about the Seahawks at 12 and the Vikings at 13. Two teams with pretty solid records right now.
Yeah, I thought about actually having the Vikings ahead of Seattle because I think right now they're better than Seahawks. Seahawks have quietly struggled over the last 4 or 5 games. They're 3-2. They're a couple of bounces away from being 1-4 during that stretch, and that's primarily on Geno Smith. He had a big productive game against the Commanders. Very vulnerable pass defense, but not very impressive. I don't think we can really rely on him. I'd even say Sam Howell was the better quarterback last week. But here's what I'm thinking here too, Josh. If they lose to the Rams this week, 49ers on Thursday Night Football, at Dallas, at San Francisco versus the Eagles, the Seahawks are very in danger of going 1-4 over the next 5 weeks. So I think, Minnesota has a much more manageable schedule. Brian Flores' defense has been fantastic. Josh Dobbs has been great. So I was on the fence between the two of them. Kind of regret it a little bit, if I'm being honest, but we'll see what happens this week.
You have the Buffalo Bills at 15. They just fired their offensive coordinator. They just lost on Monday Night Football to the Denver Broncos. Do you expect them to bounce back up, or are they just kind of a middle-of-the-road team right now?
Yeah, this is a weird one because in reality, I'd have them at 12 behind Cincinnati. But, they're 5-5 now, so a very narrow path to making the playoffs that you have to account for that stuff when you're doing these things. I think the Bills are better than the Steelers, for instance, but the Steelers have a clearer path to getting there. Buffalo, maybe can lose 1, possibly 2 games the rest of the stretch. My real thing is that 12-man on the field penalty with that missed field goal attempt. That's why the offensive coordinator got fired. At least a big reason why he got fired this week. Yeah. That's bad. That's somebody's fault that happened. And Buffalo's been a very volatile team, so you have to account for that in power rankings, where you can't just leave them alone, even though they lost the game like that under those conditions.
Maybe the other biggest underperformer this year, the Los Angeles Chargers. You have them right next to the Bills at 16. Is there any hope left for Chargers fans like myself out there?
Yeah, I got a lot of hate for this one, and I get it. There's teams with better records behind them. There's even teams with better paths to the playoffs, given, considering how weak the NFC is. But Chargers are unreliable, but they are a more dangerous team than everyone behind them on this list because of Justin Herbert. There's whispers that maybe Bill Belichick's going to the Chargers next year. If a Bill Belichick defense with Justin Herbert could make some real noise, and for this year right now, the Chargers can beat anyone. I'm not sure the Colts can go into Kansas City and beat Kansas City, for instance.
Sticking with that division, we have the Denver Broncos at 17, and then the Raiders at 22. Both of these teams are starting to surge if you look at win-loss records. Doesn't seem like you're particularly sold on either, but especially the Raiders.
Yeah, I have the Broncos at 17 and the Raiders at 22. The Raiders lost to Denver on opening day, so I get why Raider fans are upset about this. But Denver's beaten the Chiefs and Bills over the last 2 weeks. Their defense is playing very well. The Raiders have beaten 2 of the 3 worst offenses in the league with the Jets and the Giants. I don't really, the surge is nice, and Antonio Pierce is doing a really good job, but now they play Miami and the Chiefs over the next 2 weeks. They might not only lose those 2 games, they might get annihilated. So Denver's a more dangerous team. That's why I have them ahead of the Raiders, even though the Raiders beat them and have a better record.
Let's turn to some more rest of season rankings. Let's hit the receiver position.
All right, Josh. Puka Nacua was amazing early in the season. You're still very high on him. Why is that?
So when he shared the field with Cooper Kupp this year, he actually has an identical 33% target share to Cooper Kupp. Since Cooper Kupp's returned in week 5, Puka Nacua actually has more receptions per game. This offense is basically Matthew Stafford throwing to Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. There's really not much else. It's super consolidated. We like that. Weeks 15 and 17, so 2 of those 3 fantasy playoff matchups are against Washington and the Giants. I think those are 2 games where Stafford throws for 300 yards, 2, 3, 4 touchdowns. Weeks 13 and 14 are games against the Browns and at the Ravens. Those are the tough ones. Both those teams are top 9 in pressure rate against quarterbacks. Puka Nacua actually might not fare too poorly. His average depth of target's been 25% lower than Cooper Kupp this year when they've been sharing the field. I have at least some faith that Puka Nacua will be a security blanket, just like Kupp has been for Stafford these past few seasons. So I'm actually quite optimistic about how he'll do for the rest of this specific season.
Those are two important smash spots, too, against the Giants and Commanders. I love that stance. That said, Josh, we have your fantasy rankings on the site right now. Kev Wheeler, Matthew Hill are on there, too. I rank 12 defenses every week. We also have dynasty rankings, so let's touch on that real quick. Puka Nacua in dynasty is interesting to me because I don't think he's a great player. I think he's solid, reliable, tough, all those things. That's great, but I don't think he's a dynamic athlete. I don't think you could put him on any team and he'd have this success. I think Matthew Stafford's driving a lot of his production. So long term, I could see this being the best season he ever has, unless Stafford stays with the Rams long term. So I think that's kind of a 50-50 proposition. I'm curious, are you as high on Puka in dynasty as you are for the rest of this season?
I think that I will ride out the points and flip him right as the season ends. Some people might be like, "Oh, are you selling low then if there's a little bit of uncertainty with Matthew Stafford after week 17?" Maybe if that's your stance, sure. The way that I could reframe that is just imagine what his value will be if for some reason Matthew Stafford leaves and suddenly backup quarterback Carson Wentz looks like the potential 2024 starter. I assure you it can get a lot worse. I'm going to be riding out the points. I think there's going to be a lot of fantasy points for the rest of this year, and then I will kick him off the roster. He will help me win fantasy championships this year, and then he will help my league mates win me fantasy championships in future years.
I like that. I see it the same way. Just, to play devil's advocate a little here. Ian Miller, he frames Puka Nacua's production profile as historic. I would keep that in mind if you're thinking about moving him in dynasty at the end of the year. Next up, Josh, I'd argue that the Jets offense is a perfect example of why most football analytics should be used as benchmarking tools rather than let's just follow all of these blindly. You have to apply these things to your situation. I say this because Nathaniel Hackett continues to run a pass-centric offense where he's trying to beat teams with Zach Wilson in the pocket, and it simply isn't working. They should shift it. They should shift their strategy because, again, they lost to the Raiders last week because of their offense. Now, you're low on Garrett Wilson. He's 19th in fantasy points per game this season. You have him 28th in your rest of season rankings. Why is that?
Garrett Wilson just simply doesn't have weekly upside. He hasn't reached 20 PPR fantasy points in any game this year. Week 17, we've talked about it a few times, and it bears repeating because most of your league mates probably won't listen to this show specifically. And it's because week 17 is a Thursday night football game in Cleveland. Oof. I think that is, if I had to scheme up the absolute worst week 17 matchup, I'd make it a Thursday night game. I'd make it in Cleveland where there's probably bad weather. And I would choose the Cleveland Browns defense. They're quite formidable. So I don't see how you're starting Garrett Wilson as anything more than a mid to low end fantasy wide receiver 3 at best in week 17 when all the money is on the line. That probably means there's a good chance that if you have a good roster that has gotten you to week 17, you are not starting Garrett Wilson when all the money is on the line that week. I would be looking to trade him now. If someone out there really does think that he's a top 15, top 20 fantasy receiver rest of season, I would push back pretty strongly on that one.
Since you mentioned that matchup, Josh, if anyone for any reason drops the Cleveland Browns defense in your fantasy league, they could give you 40 points like the Giants, like the Cowboys did against the Giants on opening day in that matchup. We're talking defensive scores, maybe a shutout. If anyone does that, be aggressive and acquire them. Next up, Josh, we're going to stick with wide receivers. Going to give you one more question on them. Rashid Shaheed is a deep ball reliant spike week player that just had 22 and 24 receiving yards over the past 2 weeks. Yet you just moved him up 2 tiers in your rest of season rankings. Tell the people why that is, Josh.
Yeah, when you frame it like that, it sounds like I made a mistake. Michael Thomas has a significant knee injury. He's going to be out multiple weeks. And after him going out after 2 routes due to injury, we got to see Rashid Shaheed, and they want him in a full-time wide receiver 2 role in that offense. He had a career high 9 targets, season high 23% target share. I want to chase the targets with him. So even though he caught 5 of 9 for just 24 yards, that doesn't feel like a Rashid Shaheed stat line, but I do love the targets. He's been incredibly efficient throughout his career. He's got deep speed. if he has target volume paired with that, I'm excited. And then he's on bye this week. He's basically free. Ryan, you're a schedule guy. You're going to love this schedule. After the bye, here are the final 6 games of the fantasy season: at Atlanta, against the Lions, against the Panthers, against the New York Giants, at the Los Angeles Rams, and then at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Pass funnel defense. Another way we could frame this is 5 of their final 6 games are in a dome. We like that for Rashid Shaheed for this pass attack. It's either Derek Carr or Jameis Winston. I'm fine with either. I don't think Michael Thomas plays again the rest of the year, and I think if he does, we will see Rashid Shaheed perform well enough in his absence that Thomas does not get the wide receiver 2 role back.
I'm going to be honest with you, Josh. You sold me on Rashid Shaheed. I've liked the Saints schedule all year, but that playoff stretch in particular is, we're talking about deep ball reliant spike week players with an increased role. That sounds pretty tasty, Josh. Next up, some tight ends. TJ Hockenson seen some wild uses with Josh Dobbs through his first 2 games as a Viking. He's coming off season highs in targets with 15, receptions 11, receiving yards with 134, and fantasy points with 30.4. You dropped him down a tier after that, Josh. What's going on there?
Yeah, I sometimes like to zig when others zag, and it's always purposeful. Justin Jefferson should return this week. When Justin Jefferson and TJ Hockenson have been on the field together this year, Hawkinson's target share is 23%. When Justin Jefferson is not on the field, TJ Hawkinson's target share is 35%. That's a 50% increase in target share. Jefferson has been practicing this week. He should play in week 11. And I'm just going to get out ahead of this one. I think if your league mates are valuing him as if he came off a career best game or a season best game and is going to continue to deliver that, by all means, sell TJ Hockenson. I have a hard time believing that Josh Dobbs is going to support Justin Jefferson in a top 3 to top 5 receiver role for fantasy. TJ Hockenson is the tight end 2 behind only Travis Kelce. And then also Jordan Addison is supposed to continue happening. There's just a lot of stuff going on in this offense that I don't really like. And one other note is that the Vikings defense has been good. I don't know necessarily if they're going to need to be airing the ball out in the passing game each and every week. And then Josh Dobbs is quite mobile. Only Lamar Jackson has more rushing yards this year than him. Probably not as many pass attempts overall. Hawkinson's really needed that 35% target share without Jefferson to be so good in fantasy football.
Makes sense to me, Josh. Make sure you check out Josh's fantasy rankings. They come out on the site every Tuesday afternoon. You can find where he has each Viking skill position player ranked. Next up, Josh, my preseason Trey McBride enthusiasm has aged pretty well. It's been one of my better takes from the offseason. I have him on so many teams, it's almost comical. You have Trey McBride ahead of George Kittle after Kittle just had 116 yards and a touchdown in week 10. Why are you so high on Trey McBride right now?
So first with Kittle, because some people out there, they love George Kittle. Week 10, he had 4 targets. He caught 3 for the 116 yards. His target share was 15%. We should expect the target share, but not that stat line. My expected fantasy points model had him usage-wise, the average tight end with his depth of target, those types of targets, scores 8 fantasy points. He scored over 20 that week. The past 2 years, when Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, and George Kittle play together, Kittle's target share is under 14%. It is significantly behind all 3 of them. And that sample is over 200 routes. If we adjust to games, that's 6 to 7 games worth of action. We have seen that Kittle is consistently deprioritized in the pecking order for targets. And then we turn to Trey McBride. He has 3 games, the past 3 games, with a target share of at least 25%. That coincides with Zach Ertz going on injured reserve. I think even if Zach Ertz returns this year, there's no way to put the cat back in the bag with Trey McBride. And those target shares of 25% or more, I think that's as sticky as it gets because it came with 3 different quarterbacks. This guy is the game plan. It was with Josh Dobbs, then Clayton Tune, then Kyler Murray. I love a young, athletic tight end who had great production in college, who had great NFL draft capital in the second round. He's coming into his own. I mean, quarterback proof. I'm very, very excited about Trey McBride rest of season. And I don't want the headache of games where you know that Kittle's going to be getting deprioritized most weeks, and that if he doesn't break a long touchdown, you might be looking many weeks at 2 for 30, 3 for 40 type stat lines. Trey McBride, much less likely to give you that. Folks, before we end this show, we're going to put Ryan Reynolds back on the hot seat because I want to know some of his spicy playoff takes. Before we do that, make sure that you're following him at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. His work's on the33rdteam.com. Hop into the Discord. It's free. It is linked in all of our articles on the site. It's linked in our Twitter bios as well. Now, Ryan, I want one surprising team that makes the playoffs, and I'm going to want one surprising team that you think might miss the playoffs. Talk me through some potentially contrarian playoff thoughts that are on your mind.
That's a good question, Josh. I like that. I think Seattle's really in danger of making the playoffs. The problem there is I don't know which NFC team takes their place. No one wants to win the NFC South, so the idea of a second team, making a wild card run is getting narrower by the week. It could be the Commanders, but their second half schedule is brutal. I think that's going to be what keeps them out. The Bears have too much ground to make up. They're 3-7. I don't think they can get there because of that. Same with the Rams. They have a very hard second half schedule, only have 3 wins. So I think what I'm going to go with here is the 6-3 Steelers fall out. They end up 10-7. And the Texans, with their very manageable second half schedule, Josh, we bet on the Texans this February, over 5.5 wins. We might win that this week. I have a habit of making, win total bets where at least one of them wins in November. I was not expecting that out of the Texans this year. But I think they have, with how well C.J. Stroud's playing, they're a well-coached team, and their manageable second-half schedule. I think they have enough juice to get to 10-7, and they have a direct tiebreaker over the Steelers.